Hello, everyone. My name is Carmel Shachar, and I'm the Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. I'm excited to welcome you to our event, Setting a National Psychedelic Policy Agenda. This is going to be a moderated conversation between several thought leaders thinking about looking forward, what does our national policy agenda need to look like when it comes to psychedelics regulation and access? Because it's a moderated conversation, I strongly encourage everybody to submit questions because we'd like to pose your questions to the panelists. How do you submit questions? Well, by far and away, the best way to do that is to use the Zoom Q&A feature found in the meeting controls at the bottom of your screen. We will be combing through the submitted questions and bring those questions to our panelists. You can also join the conversation or even submit a question on Twitter. We're at Petrie-Flom, and please use the hashtag Poplar. Again, that's hashtag Poplar. If you have any technical issues, please don't use those two venues. Please email us at petrie-flom@law.harvard.edu, and we'll try to help you as best we can. If you like what you see, but you're unfamiliar with our work, I strongly suggest that you sign up for our newsletter. It comes out twice a month, so it won't clog your inbox, and it's by far the best way to know about upcoming events, what scholarship our affiliates are putting out, including our affiliates of our Poplar project. I also encourage you to read Bill of Health, our blog, which features cutting-edge health policy, health law, and bioethics research and perspectives, as well as to check out our event slate. We have a really robust event slate. We are tackling a diverse group of topics. We are working on adding events looking at medical decision-making in prisons, for example. We're also considering the role of crisis standard of care when it comes to healthcare, as well as its impact on people living with disabilities. We have a fantastic series on substance use disorders and the judicial system, and what do judges in particular need to understand when it comes to use of these substances. And of course, our Poplar project keeps very busy with a variety of events, so we'd love to see you at future events. Speaking of Poplar, I would like to introduce Mason Marks, who is Assistant Professor of Law at the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law, as well as Senior Fellow, Project Lead, and co-founder of the Project on Psychedelic Law and Regulation, or Poplar, here at the Petrie-Flom Center. Mason will be our moderator for the day and really our guide through this conversation. Mason, I'm delighted to hand the reins over to you.
Thank you so much, Carmel, and welcome to all of our panelists and attendees. I also want to thank Laura Chong and Chloe Reichel of the Petrie-Flom Center for helping to make this event possible. So we're in a period of time that many people refer to as the Psychedelic Renaissance, which is characterized by increasing interest in researching, commercializing, and consuming psychedelics for a variety of purposes. These are substances that include psilocybin, ibogaine, dimethyltryptamine, MDMA, and some would say ketamine as well. Many of these substances are familiar to indigenous communities that have used them for centuries, more likely millennia, for religious and healing purposes. They're often used in a communal setting in that case. But some psychedelics were first synthesized in the 20th century, and both naturally occurring and synthetic psychedelics were studied quite extensively in the 50s and 60s by Western scientists until passage of the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which was drafted by the Nixon administration, essentially prohibited them. And fast forward to today, there are groups of scientists and activists that have been working very hard for the past 20 or 30 years to bring us to the psychedelic renaissance, this period in which we find ourselves. And there are many groups coalescing around shaping the national psychedelic policy agenda. And we're very fortunate to have a group of experts, each of which represents sometimes several of these organizations. And I think I will now invite our panelists to introduce themselves and take a few minutes to tell us about their work and the organizations that they represent. And we'll turn first to Ismail Lourido Ali, and then we'll go to Ariel Clark.
Great. Thanks so much, Mason, and thank you so much to the Petrie-Flom and Poplar Center in Poplar for inviting me to join this conversation today. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, my name is Ismail Lourido Ali, as you said. I'm based on the West Coast here in Berkeley, California, and most of the time I spend as the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, also known as MAPS, a 501c3 nonprofit that was founded in 1986 to do research and education in the realm of psychedelic science, therapy, and research. I also spend time doing a few other projects in the psychedelic and drug policy reform space. I worked with Students for Sensible Drug Policy for a few years. I am one of the co-founders, along with Ariel, of the Psychedelic Bar Association. So if there's anyone or legal professionals in the audience, feel free to throw in a question in the chat about that. We'll put in some information. And I also work with a few other organizations like the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, with the Chacruna Institute for Plant Medicines. And I feel very honored and grateful that I get to participate in a few different ways in this space. I've been around the psychedelic space on a personal level for about 15 or 16 years, both in celebratory and sacramental environments, which means that I've seen and experienced and been adjacent to a number of different ways and frameworks through which psychedelics are utilized currently, at least under prohibition or in unregulated or legal spaces in other countries. So really appreciate this conversation about how we bring this specifically to the US federal kind of national environment and conversation, and it's about time. So happy to be here.
It's great to have you. Ariel, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mason. Thank you so much for inviting me to today's conversation. My name is Ariel. I also am based on the West Coast. Though I'm from the Great Lakes area, I am of a mixed race background. I am Odawa Anishinaabe and French American lineage. And I bring that forward because that is how I come to this discussion. I have spent my life, I'm a lawyer and an activist, a policy reformer, drug policy reformer, have done a lot of work around Indian rights related issues. And over the course of my career, I'm a founding partner of Howell LLP. We're a firm that's focused on cannabis and psychedelics, and I've worked, and we still work with tribes and on issues related to Native people. I also am part of a founding member of the Psychedelic Bar Association. We're doing really interesting work around religious use, around legalization and regulation, around imagining corporate forms and ethics, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk about that. I'm also involved with the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicine, and I'm on the board and I'm general legal counsel. And my relationship coming to this space with psychedelics and plant medicines is personally, I have had the beautiful opportunity of sitting with medicines in a sacramental context, as well as working with therapists through my own healing journey, healing racial trauma, and you know, just kind of a personal healing path. So I'm very honored to be here. I'm really excited for this conversation to talk about what federal policy, you know, concerns and thoughts I have, and hear from everyone and everyone who's participating today. So thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Micah, welcome.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on what time zone you're in. Thank you very much for your invitation to this important conversation today, Mason, and thank you very much to the Petrie-Flom team for your wonderful work getting us all convened here today. Again, my name is Micah Haskell-Hoehl. As of June of 2021, I'm founder of Healing, Equity, and Liberation, or HEAL. We're a federal policy organization focused on creating a justice framework for psychedelic decriminalization, regulation, and healing. I come to this work from a nearly 20-year background working on federal policy, including in areas related to education, mental and behavioral health, other child and family serving agencies like child welfare, child protective services, et cetera. But most recently, and over the last 5 years before I started HEAL, working mostly on criminal legal system reform issues, where I really was somewhat deeply radicalized related to issues surrounding racial justice, Indigenous justice, and other related issues. And that is much of the lens that I have been bringing to my work in the federal psychedelic space. And thinking about, as this psychedelic renaissance unfolds, wondering about exactly what the situation with federal policy changes are going to look like in another 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, 10, 20 years down the road, and just wanting to make sure that those in this country and around the world who have been historically excluded from the benefits of Western development and like the creation of lots of wealth in our societies are not excluded from what happens with psychedelics, that those benefits are equitably distributed throughout society. So those are sort of the questions that are at the center of HEAL's work right now. And I'm really excited to talk a little bit more about the broader, just general federal policy landscape and our work. And just personally, I have been interested in psychedelics since the mid-90s, probably. I like to joke that I was using a web crawler search engine and looking at the MAPS website when it was brand new in the mid-90s, I think, and started to have some personal experiences with psychedelics a few years after that, and have had some real important healing journeys in my life with the use of psychedelics, including having like a 2-year-long depression basically lift like the fog after I went to a couple of raves and used unregulated MDMA, which is probably not the way that we really want people to be engaging with this necessarily, or probably not a 17-year-old. But that said, it has really led me to a place where I believe very deeply in the healing potential for these medicines. And again, really hope that the way that the psychedelic renaissance unfolds into society can benefit those who have been most marginalized and most excluded from again, all the benefits and largesse of Western culture. So really grateful to be here for this conversation and looking forward to it. Thanks, Mason, and everyone.
Thank you, Micah. So from a legal perspective, we've seen a lot of activity in the past few years at the state and local levels, but there really hasn't been a whole lot of activity on the federal level. So my first question to you is about first steps. So if you were to start crafting a national psychedelic policy agenda, where would you start? What are some of the most pressing issues right now that you think are important to tackle first?
Please. Okay. I'll jump in here. I know that a lot of us in the space talk about the need for rescheduling for purposes of drug research. I think that's very important. Of course, MAPS is in a process of MDMA, access through the FDA system. And so I just would like to bring forward that, really drug rescheduling research is very important. I have kind of concerns piggybacking off what Micah, you were saying about access and affordability for people. I'm interested in all of that, and it's great that some research is happening. We need a lot more. We also need therapists and clinical trials for, that involve not just, that involve insular minorities, Native people, Black folks. We need this type of training. I get a little bit nervous about the pharmaceuticalization of these types of natural medicines and psychedelics and sort of what the drivers are in those respects. I once heard someone say something about, like, in a couple of years, we may turn on the TV and have commercials that say things like, ask your doctor if MDMA is right for you. I'm concerned about that. I learned recently also in the past couple of years that the United States and New Zealand are the only two countries where you can actually advertise drugs on TV. So while we want research, while we want access and affordability, I really want this national conversation around psychedelic and plant medicine reform to really look different than other spaces, than you know, kind of the regular track of pharmaceuticals, and sort of what propels those companies and the drivers, sort of the market drivers, and who's doing the research and how that research is being done. And I know that's kind of a very open-ended discussion, but it's something that I would kind of like to offer in response.
Thanks for that great question. And I think it's complicated because I think there is what we want, and then there's also what's possible right now. And I really think that there is no low-hanging fruit when it comes to federal psychedelics policy. There are the changes that are kind of bubbling, like NIH being directed to fund psychedelic research by Congress, which is really exciting. And some of our friends across Washington, D.C. have been really successful in getting Congress to start trying to put the screws to NIH in that way. But again, just thinking about what we want to see in 6 months, 2 years, 20 years down the road, you know, again, what's possible now versus what we really want to ensure happens in the long term, and just trying to make sure that whatever policies are unfolding, that the principles of justice and equity and agency for individuals and communities to define and create healing for themselves, I think are just really important. And yet also some sort of more concrete things that I would want to put on the table include, now that we're seeing jurisdiction by jurisdiction decriminalization, including legalization frameworks in certain states like Oregon, potentially other legalization frameworks coming up in other states, is we probably need the DOJ to make some sort of commitment to not prosecute psychedelic related offenses in these jurisdictions. I think that would be really, really critical. And then sort of more lofty, longer term ideal goal for me, I think also is federal decriminalization pretty much across the board of all drugs and people who use them, and an attendant accounting for and repair of drug war harms and harms related to colonization, and really get the boot off of the neck of people out in communities across the country who want to use these tools and these substances in a way that they have for years and decades very effectively. They know how to do the work. The medicine is cheap. And I really think that decriminalization is one of the ways that folks are going to be able to do the work that they have been doing, want to do, come out of the shadows, do it even more safely and more effectively, and reach more people. So that's what I would add to the discussion here.
Yeah, I agree with basically everything that Ariel and Micah just said. Want to plus one the idea of, I think the most common and the thing that we hear the most of, because of its proximity to what might be realistic, is having any NIH or a related agency be directed to fund. And some people might have noticed that NIH released funds for its first, I think first two actually, potentially positive aiming psychedelic research in the last few months, one about smoking cessation and then another. So I think that seems like what, you know, Michael, you were saying around like the closest thing to low-hanging fruit and the closest thing that's possible. I actually think also, Ariel, to your earlier point, I agree with you around the concerns in general about pharmaceuticalization and medicalization, despite the path that MAPS is taking to do that with MDMA. And I think that when we're looking at that angle, I actually think the most impactful thing that I would like to see is something resembling universal healthcare, because I actually feel like the groundwork of having a universal healthcare system would impact a lot of the questions that we're talking about now, from access to the substance itself to the treatment side. You know, I think of it as, how do we have a lot of on-ramps and a lot of off-ramps, because there are people who have problematic relationships or who need support with various substances. And I think having some sort of system that would actually could support people from the beginning to the end, from a preventative to a post framework, would be a huge factor. I agree with the idea of having some sort of guidance from the DOJ to allow the states to experiment. We're kind of in that point where we want to see how different states will develop different programs from different, like, I kind of think of it as a gradient where you have like very highly regulated, maybe even medicalized, or highly regulated but adult use, kind of what you're seeing in Oregon, to various shades of decrim and regulated use. And I think room for the states to experiment at this point in time is really essential, because we want to be able to collect the data and the information that we can over the next few years to see what actually works and what doesn't work. And while prohibition is really a blip in the total history, substances have been traded and utilized in a variety of ways for much longer than the last 50 years or even 120, depending on when you started, of prohibition, we are in many ways in a new paradigm. So I think that the idea of allowing the states to have room to try a few different things is a really important thing. And the only other thing I would add that I think wasn't explicitly mentioned yet is I do think that it's time for an update to RFRA and which is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The short version is that it was passed in 1993 after a really unpopular Supreme Court decision that basically, granted and expanded the religious rights of people in the United States, including rights related to controlled substances. In the particular case of RFRA, peyote for Native Americans, and then it was expanded in 2006 to include ayahuasca for certain churches within the United States. Not all of them, I want to be very clear about that, but that's part of the issue. We're now in an environment where the use of the spiritual and sacramental use of certain substances has expanded, and it's become more popular and people have become more aware of it. And I think that the law hasn't necessarily caught up, and many people are who are utilizing psychedelics and utilizing entheogens in a spiritual way, in a sacramental way, don't really have the protection and support they might need. Some of that might be able to get done at the state level, but ultimately I think that we're due for an update to what the kind of federal framework for sacramental use of substances are. And again, it's not coming out of nowhere. It's kind of building on this precedent that has already been occurring over the last 20 or 30 years. So I'll start there. There's more, but I think that's a good bit of groundwork for all of us to be jumping into.
No, that's great. I think I want to pick up on religious use because we have a question about that from Victoria Littman. To what extent do you think the FDA, or alternatively the DEA, can play a role in promoting risk or harm reduction in legally protected religious use of psychedelics? And that's an interesting question because I think some might say, well, what business would the FDA have in a religious use context? But I think the DEA is perhaps an even stranger agency to be regulating religious use. And that's actually the case now that the DEA is the primary agency responsible for granting religious exemptions to federal controlled substance law. But what would be the ideal role of these agencies in the religious use context, or should they not be involved? Maybe there should be some other type of system. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I can jump in, but I'd be curious to hear Ariel's thoughts also, because I know we've been thinking about this for quite a while. So it depends on what time of day you ask me. Sometimes I think that the FDA and DEA should have nothing to do with this question at all. FDA, I think, is probably the most outside of it. They really fall into the realm of regulating food and drug supplies, and part of the kind of legal framework for religious use in the United States, and I don't necessarily agree with this, but descriptively, is that religious use is considered non-drug use. It actually is arguably exempt entirely from the Controlled Substances Act, because the Controlled Substances Act is meant to regulate and control the use of drugs in certain frameworks and allow for certain types of use, including research, science, and medical use. The Controlled Substances Act itself does not include itself exemptions or descriptions of what religious use might look like. So it's been argued in the past successfully that the use of controlled substances in a religious framework actually is fully outside of the realm of the Controlled Substances Act. What that means practically, it is true, as you said, Mason, that right now the DEA has a lot of power and agency and oversight over de facto, whether or not that's legally true is kind of a different question, but over the rights that churches or communities that use psychedelics in sacramental ways currently they kind of have to navigate that relationship. And I struggle with this question a lot because on one hand, I do think that it's reasonable to ask for some sort of safety, quality control mechanism. Sometimes, when we're looking outside of the religious framework, we sometimes describe it as safe supply, where you actually have some sort of quality control over the origin, the manufacturer, for lack of a better word. And then when people are consuming something, you generally want that thing to be safe and you want to know where it came from. I think that's reasonable, although it's complicated to then create these regulatory systems that impose certain elements of that quality control when you're talking about practices that have generally emerged outside of that framework. So trying to kind of fit our current regulatory options on top of this practice that in many ways falls entirely outside of the regulatory system can be quite challenging. So alternatively, I don't like the idea of creating some sort of like government agency that's tasked with determining whether someone is religious or not. That seems like a rabbit hole, or at least like a slippery slope that feels risky. So I do like the option that I've heard people talk about with respect to kind of some level of self-regulating systems with basic kind of safety oversight. Where those boundaries are drawn, I think, is a really open question. And there's just, I feel like it's, I don't want to say urgent, but I feel like it's really critical that we figure this out sooner than later, because right now, the kind of spiritual or sacramental use of these substances is only growing. And the ways that we approach that is very, very different from how we look at it in medical use, treatment for an indication or even regulated adult use. So that wasn't a great answer to your question, but it's I'm always thinking about how we weigh those things. I'm curious about what others think.
I would just add a couple of things. Ayahuasca seizures have increased in the last couple of years. And the DEA hasn't granted any exemptions for any sort of sacramental use. I wonder about, on some level, this conversation around psychedelics and plant medicine is sort of a conversation around different cultural paradigms. So what I would like to see is the DEA somehow be in a place of deep listening to other perspectives and other cultures. And similarly with the FDA, and kind of overall in this conversation, Mason, at the beginning, I very much appreciated that you immediately brought in the Indigenous people and traditions and lineages that have been held for so long, and that the Controlled Substances Act and this very antiquated and deeply unhelpful policy and really deep kind of fear-based policy has been really a blip on the radar of all of these medicines and technologies that have been used. And so really bringing that in and having almost like cultural education and a listen, and coming to this from a listening place. Is the DEA capable of that? Are we capable of that? Dominant culture doesn't tend to come from a place of the ability to hold and listen, but maybe that's the opportunity that we are being presented with in this very important moment. As you also spoke about at the beginning, that we are at the beginning of this kind of like emergent moment, grappling with these issues. These are the moments that are the most ripe for opportunities for deep listening, for paradigm shifts. I mean, we use that term for a reason, because there is an opportunity to come to something arguably from a new perspective, or one where we can welcome many perspectives. And so kind of all around this conversation about federal policy, it really must be a place where different perspectives sit at a round table and are listened to equally, all of us. So that's just kind of what I would add to that.
One tiny statement, just to clarify for the audience, Ariel, when Ariel says ayahuasca seizures, she's talking about seizures of the medicine that's coming into the United States by Customs and Border Patrol. I just want to clarify that it's not an increase in like health effects. It's an increase in interdictions at the border. Sorry, Ariel, I just wanted to make sure that the audience wasn't confused on that important piece.
Thanks, Izzy.
I don't know that there's actually that much that I could add here that would be of more value than what our colleagues have just said on this issue. And what you just said, Ariel, in terms of the importance of bringing different people and parties and perspectives and epistemologies and way of knowing to the table in the conversation around psychedelics and where we're going as a society in general, I think, was so well taken. And Mason, I don't know if I could, if you would indulge me to just say a few words about the way that we at Heal are trying to sort of model that in the way that we're working. This isn't related to the audience question, so apologies. And I just want to throw it out there. The questions that we want to put on the table and answer related to what federal psychedelics policy should look like as it unfolds. Honestly, I don't really believe that I am super qualified, me as myself, to answer most of those questions. And what we have done at HEAL is created this coalition called the National Council on Federal Psychedelics Priorities to do some of, I think, exactly what you're talking about, Ariel, is try to bring those who have shared and demonstrated commitment to justice and equity, and again, individual and community agency, and like defining healing together to come up with a federal policy agenda for psychedelics. And so we're focusing on issues like decriminalization and regulation, religious use, Indigenous justice, justice and healing for marginalized populations more broadly, the creation of knowledge and research. And we've got approximately, I'd say, 36 individuals and organizations from across the country who are part of this conversation, representing many, many different perspectives and having really important, very nuanced, broad and deep conversations about everything that we're discussing here and more. So I think, I just very much +1 the notion that what we need to do is be creating this very big table to talk and build and share power and try to make sure that this movement, when it does sort of train its fire on federal policy, is doing so in a way that's very moral and competent and really embodies the principles that many of us and the diversity of the psychedelic movement is bringing to bear on all of this work. So thank you again for indulging me in the slight tangent, but I just really wanted to make sure to talk about what I feel is one of our most exciting sort of public facing projects we're working on right now.
Thanks for bringing that into the conversation. I might like to delve into that a bit more in a moment. I want to bring in another audience question. This is from Michael Gessie or Getchy. Isn't part of the issue with psychedelics as well as cannabis that the Controlled Substances Act is antiquated and grossly false? Tens of thousands of citizens are in prison for nonviolent Schedule I violations. The data, the science, and the facts should matter. So isn't this ultimately an issue for Congress to address that head on? And I guess as kind of an addendum to that, what's preventing that? And is this even an issue that's on the radar of members of Congress right now?
I'll answer some of the first pieces first. The short answer to the last part is that I do believe that there's a general sense within a number of members of Congress, and certainly the American public, that the Controlled Substances Act and the current kind of drug control scheme is not working. And interestingly, we're also seeing a lot of that awareness at the international level, where the UN is kind of, or UN member states are kind of looking at the US as we start to change drug laws, despite being kind of the engine of drug prohibition globally over the last 100 years, and seeing kind of the contradiction or hypocrisy that's kind of coming out of that. So it's definitely not an unusual perspective, I think, to recognize that the current drug control scheme is not working. The question made me think of something that seems like it comes up a lot in drug policy reform, especially, which is the idea that when these kind of initial slate of policies were developed, there wasn't very much public discussion or evidence brought in. It was much of the US drug control system and global drug control system was developed from an ideological lens. And it's interesting now to be in a position twofold. One, of trying to find the evidence to undermine, undercut, and transition away from prohibition and the Controlled Substances Act, while also recognizing the sometimes crushing reality that evidence alone is not what's going to change policy. And I think that's a thing that is a big part of it. I agree completely with the question, where it is true that I think we can empirically, if you wish, kind of look at elements of the global drug control system, of the Controlled Substances Act specifically, and so on, and see how, okay, we can point directly to data over the course of at least 50 years of how all of these things has failed, even on its own metrics. And also, I think there's kind of a behind the veil understanding where good or policy itself is not based on good evidence and data. Unfortunately, it helps, but one of the big kind of disillusionments I think I experienced starting to work in policy over the last few years has been how much of policy is also based not just on public perception, not just on evidence, but also these ideological commitments that come with these concepts. So in general, I think, yeah, it would make sense for there to be a full overhaul, you could say, of the Controlled Substances Act and the entire kind of drug reform system. I think there's certain elements that make sense, like we were talking about earlier with respect to safety and quality control. And I think so many people are so interested in legalization or regulation of drugs because we've seen that under prohibition, the risks of adulteration are deadly for hundreds of thousands of people. So we've seen how those things have occurred. But one framing that's been helpful for me is saying, well, we were for a long time, and over time, we've been able to develop this argument that the war on drugs as we know it is failing. But as soon as we turn from the past to the future and start looking at what are the things that we actually want to create, the differences really start to get more crunchy, because I think it's harder to tell, well, what do we want to move toward? And to Micah's point earlier, and something that Ariel also mentioned, we're not just moving toward like a new sunny future, we're actually looking at the past and having to repair at least 50, if not 100 or 500 years of harms. And that's a lot of baggage to carry. So I think that there's both what is the evidence-based kind of policy approach that we can create, that's one part of it, but then how do we also try to actually repair some of those harms from the bad policy that's occurred? And I think that's a tougher but also equally essential question. I don't know if that fully answers the question, but that's kind of some of the stuff that I think has come up in general for me.
Yeah, I mean, the Controlled Substances Act and the war on drugs, which now is 50 years old as of last June, have justified an absolute reign of terror on Americans and particularly communities of color. And it's beyond time to move past this, even though I'm sure we'll come up with some other excuse to try and oppress poor people and people of color if we did repeal all of the drug laws tomorrow. There is a growing awareness, I think, in the American public about the failure of the war on drugs, even though I guess it's actually doing what it was intended. So to say it's a failure probably is a misnomer, but people are fed up with the war on drugs. There was a lot of survey data from the 50th anniversary of the war on drugs that was collected and reported by Drug Policy Alliance and some of their partners that showed that, you know, a majority of Americans are pretty much not on board with continuing this set of policies anymore. And to just give one little bit from the lay of the land of what's going on in Washington, D.C. with, you know, hopefully drug war abolition, but, you know, we're a ways away. I was looking up the Drug Policy Reform Act, which was introduced last session of Congress for the first time, which would basically end federal drug criminalization, as well as move key components of administration of the Controlled Substances Act from the Department of Justice to Health and Human Services, which would be a very important move, I think. Unsurprisingly, this is a bill that was introduced by two Black female members of Congress, and it only had 17 co-sponsors when the last session of Congress ended. So despite a pretty huge groundswell of support for major changes on this front in the public, it's not necessarily translating into a lot of politicians at this point wanting to stick their necks out for endorsing basically an end to the federal war on drugs. So I'm not really sure how we make this all connect in the middle and make all of that public groundswell of support again turn into political will and political capital. But I mean, obviously it's beyond time for these things to change. And one more area where policymakers who are supposed to ostensibly be leaders needing to be dragged kicking and screaming by the American public.
It seems like in recent years, there have been potentially dozens of cannabis reform bills proposed in Congress, and none of which have been successful so far. And cannabis rescheduling is something that President Biden ran on during his campaign and has not yet acted on or addressed. Given that, should we be more optimistic, less optimistic about psychedelics reform? And what are some of the similarities and differences between these two areas of policy? I can add a twist. A twist would be that we're talking about reforming or ending the drug war, or at least improving conditions. And a common response from people when they hear that is that psychedelics don't really play a role in the war on drugs. There are very few arrests for psychedelics related offenses. That's usually a response heard that kind of, you know, dampens enthusiasm a bit for reform. What is the role of psychedelics in the broader context of the war on drugs, or how might you respond to that particular comment?
I can share some thoughts to start. I think they were all just really polite and want to hear each other talk. So just, I'll start with the latter kind of twist question, because there are a lot of things that could be said about cannabis reform and its relationship to the work, but I actually think that the broader question is also quite relevant. One thing that's really interesting about this kind of conversation about psychedelic reform in general is that there's a lot of excitement and not a lot of data. There's a lot of enthusiasm because people are kind of, I think in some ways, reacting to prohibition in the excitement. And I see like the almost evangelist approach that, you know, certain members of the community and also the media is taking about it. And I think it's really important just in general for people to remember that we're not talking about silver bullets. We're talking about changes in policy for the utilization or implementation or incorporation of certain substances into society in a variety of different ways. And what that tells me about the bigger drug policy reform question is that there's a lot of groundwork that we can and should lay that's going to come in handy or be really important when we're actually looking beyond not just cannabis, not just psychedelics, but into a post-prohibition world. So when I've been thinking about and help supporting people in crafting kind of legislation and other efforts across the country, one thing that's always on my mind is how can the enthusiasm for psychedelic policy reform lay groundwork for future changes and future elements that we might want to see. So I'll just give a couple examples. In a world where we get some of what we want, where drugs are no longer criminalized, maybe they're treated as a health issue, maybe there's a rational quality control, regulated system for access for people that are seeking it, treatment and support for people who are seeking support for problematic or chaotic use. Let's say we have all of those things. One or a couple elements that we're also going to want there are the elements of education and harm reduction. This last year was the first time that the federal government issued any funds toward harm reduction specifically. It was a relatively small amount that was spread across organizations across the country. But I think it was promising in the sense that it showed that there's a sense that our old ways or our kind of expected ways of handling drug problems are not sufficient. They're clearly not working, and the alternative systems, I don't see harm reduction as so alternative because it's so prolific in certain communities and certain spaces, but certainly from the perspective of the federal government, is a relatively like new intervention, you could say. The reason I think that's relevant is because in the same way that cannabis gave us, I think, a lot of insight into what it might look like to create a legal regulated market, both the good stuff and the very bad stuff, for the sale, manufacture, production, utilization of a substance that's currently controlled. And we can learn a lot of lessons from cannabis, whether it comes to taxation, to manufacture, to licensing, to oversight. There's a lot of lessons learned, both good and bad, I think, there. I think we can also use this momentum to say, what are the other things we'd want to see in place? I would like to see an education system that's honest and evidence-based for the public, for young people in schools. I think that piece would not just benefit all the things that we're hoping to see with respect to psychedelics, it would actually make everybody and society as a whole safer and healthier, even and especially in an environment where we made these larger changes around decriminalization, health access, and so on. So one way that I've been thinking about connecting these things is like, what is the groundwork that the psychedelic field can lay that doesn't just benefit people who like psychedelics or want to use them for religious or medical or personal purposes? What are the other things that we'd want to see? Education being one of them, harm reduction services being one of them, and universal healthcare being another one of them. Because I think anytime that there's a crack for someone to fall through, we have to assume that that can happen. So the more we can kind of create these safety nets in different elements in different areas, the less likely it is to see a backlash to these bold policy changes that we've already been talking about today. And that's one of the things I worry about. I think it's important to think visionary. It's important to think in a bold way. And also doing it too fast without the right groundwork will inevitably result in a backlash. We see it all the time. We see it in cannabis. We see it with a lot of other elements of drug policy reform. So all that to say that I do think that one of the big roles we can take from cannabis is lessons learned from the creation of a market, both the good and the bad, how to be really careful about monopolization and corporatization, while also recognizing that there's key differences, both in the way that the substances are used, the way that they're most safely used. But there's a key thing there where people should have the sovereignty to make decisions about what they do with their own body. And the government, insofar as it's involved, should be working toward the safety, sovereignty of those people, not taking it away just for the choices they make about what they decide to do.
I guess one concern that I would air is that movement on psychedelic reform issues not be engaged in a way where if we make a lot of progress on psychedelics, that sort of suck up all the oxygen for movement on additional drug policy reforms. And I think in the cannabis space, we recently saw a dynamic occur at the federal level that I think is a little bit parallel. There was a possibility that some language was going to be included in the big federal spending package at the end of last year that would have sort of established a legal framework for cannabis businesses to be able to start using like actual banks to park their money in. And the folks in the broader cannabis and drug reform movement really fought tooth and nail to stop that, because there was no additional language for federal decriminalization or anything like that, nothing about record expungement, none of the other broader drug policy reform principles that that community has been working on for years and years. And the concern was that if the banking bill passed, that there would just be like no political will to do anything on cannabis again for God knows how long. And I do have a concern about a similar dynamic cropping up across the cannabis and psychedelic, not divide, but the boundary between those two sort of substantive areas. And I really do think that it's a very psychedelic thing for this movement to be for just the drug policy reform movement more broadly as well. I just can't think of a worse way that this society inflicts violence on people than harassment by police, prosecution, incarceration in jails and prisons. And to me, psychedelics in part, like the spirit of it is about sort of like letting us tap in with our own humanity, unleashing the potential of human freedom. And if like that's what this movement is about, or at least parts of this movement are about, then I really do think that we should be for trying to get rid of these systems of just social violence that are unleashed by the government on people. So just some of the thoughts that come up for me related to cannabis and psychedelics and the broader drug policy reform movement.
And I'll just add, I've had a lot of experience with cannabis policy reform over the years, particularly though in California on a state level and locally. And I just kind of want to add to Izzy your thoughts on what we can do right now. So we've got federal policy changes, and I'm grateful to be part of this conversation, but my many years have been very much focused on state and local policy changes. And, some things that I think about, well, first of all, we've learned a lot about what not to do in the cannabis space, I would say, and I could go on about that for a long time. In California, the cannabis ecosystem is largely failing. Things that we could do in the psychedelics plant medicine community are really to dig into what we need within communities. So I know questions that, for example, Oregon is grappling with and we're grappling with in California and across the board are, for example, how are facilitators trained? What are the ethics within our communities? That's going to be probably determined by different state regulatory systems. And so those are things that, we can really sit with, I think, right now. The issues with cannabis really are so very different. And so, it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens as things continue to unfold, certainly in Oregon and in California. We have a state decriminalization and light regulation measure that, we may end up, we'll see what happens this next year. But I would say really focusing on local, both, local city, county, but also state regulatory systems, and having these conversations around these substances are very important.
You mentioned state regulation and local regulation, and Gaetano asked us a question about a federal issue that really affects state and local businesses, and that is the banking and tax policy. And so are the banking and tax issues associated with cannabis the same for psychedelics? And is that an area of federal reform that we should be pursuing?
I'll answer that and just say yes. The banking and tax issues with cannabis all start because cannabis is a Schedule I controlled substance. So banks won't touch cannabis money, basically. I mean, some will, and there are very onerous know your customer requirements, basically, that folks have to go through, and only certain banks work with cannabis companies if you're state legal. But ultimately, banks are risk averse, so they're concerned with banking cannabis funds. When it comes to psychedelics, the most psychedelics, except if we're talking about ketamine, that is scheduled, I think, Schedule 4 or Schedule 3, then Schedule 3, then you may be able to access banking, and you may not be subject to 280E, which is a very punitive tax statute that disallows businesses to deduct regular business expenses. So yeah, we definitely, those changes are those issues are very impactful in the cannabis space, that will also and do translate in the psychedelic space for sure.
I could throw out a word kind of jumping off of what Ariel was saying. I think a lot of what you were talking about has to do with this big, scary question of implementation. And I just wanted to bring that into the room, because I feel like there's a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about. There's the question of like, how do we get to the point where we see a change or kind of begin the process of the paradigm shift? And then I think that is often led by activists, by people who are willing to kind of stick their neck out early, take risks, and engage in something that falls outside of the realm of what's accepted in general in society, at least by and large. And then there's the second pace, and we're actually at that point now, I think, within the field of psychedelics, where we're right at that teetering point where we're now having to seriously look at and think about implementation. You see that with the process that's going on in Oregon. I think a lot of the issues that you just brought up, Ariel, were things that maybe were somewhat thought through before some of these cannabis laws were passed, but obviously, because we're now years and years later and they haven't been solved yet, we're not clearly thought through enough, or at least not enough has changed to make the kind of change, the full spectrum of change that we're hoping to see possible. So I think another element here, both from the perspective of how and what is the federal government's role in supporting or staying out of the way of any of these state efforts, or making it possible for these state efforts to succeed. I do think it's important to remember that the efforts that are needed to implement a law and implement policy change are quite different than the agitation and confrontation needed to actually get the law changed. And one thing that I hope to see is stamina. There's a lot of people who want to get involved to change stuff, but I really hope to see stamina over years and decades to actually make sure that these things are implemented, because if not, there will be a backlash, and there will be not just like a social, cultural backlash, but there will be a legal backlash. There's a reason why we want to make sure that the groundwork is there from the beginning. So it'd be good to learn these lessons that, Ariel, you're bringing up ahead of time. May not be able to solve for all of them. We may not be able to solve them all ahead of time, but I think just being aware and kind of not being too distracted by how excited and exciting people can be and are about the topic, and also think about what are the implementation side questions we need to be considering to make sure that whatever change we're hoping to make is successful, or at least takes us in the right direction.
We have so many questions and so little time. I'm really grateful for the engagement from the audience. We have a question from Peter Lakov, which is essentially about the international community and looking to other countries. Should we take inspiration from other countries? Are there any specific examples that are a good model for legislators here in the US?
I don't think that there's a single good model. I'll start to answer it that way. I do think that there are elements of regulatory systems or deregulated systems that exist in other countries that would be worth really seriously looking at. Portugal's often cited because of its choice to decriminalize the personal use and then create broader access to therapeutic or treatment services I think about 18 years ago now. Spain and Czech Republic both also have very lax personal possession or non-existent personal possession criminalization laws. We have a few examples where you see kind of federal level regulation of something like cannabis. You see it in places like Uruguay and other countries, including Mexico and other places, are really seriously trying to engage with this question of regulation. And most often with respect to psychedelics in particular, we're kind of see a bunch of unregulated or kind of gray area regulated systems. So there's a bit of a patchwork internationally, but I actually don't think that I haven't for myself really seen like a system that I think works for all of the issues that we're looking at and dealing with. And I think to your very early point, Ariel, about like commercialization and advertisement, I think that there's a sense that if we regulate a substance legally, it must fall into kind of a traditional commercial market structure with all of the baggage. And I think that that's because we don't have that many great examples to look at of, you know, highly regulated substances that are also available enough that it undercuts kind of whatever underground economy people are concerned about. All that to say that I do think that that patchwork can be kind of brought together, and I think that there are going to be opportunities over the next decade or so to think about what a full spectrum regulatory system might look like. But one of the things that makes me skeptical about that right now is that the drug trade is rarely one that occurs locally. It's not true for all the substances, but in many, many cases, there's like an inherently international component. So even if we had good examples in a specific country, what we don't have is good examples among trade with trade among countries, producer states and consumer states and so on, that I think would have to be part of what I would see as like the actual full spectrum shift. And as long as we have like very consistent lack of consensus internationally, it'll be hard to see what that appropriate system might look like. I'm really encouraged by efforts, I would say, that don't exist yet, but I think are potentially in the pipeline for the next couple of decades. I think I'm really inspired by the efforts in Colombia, the country that my mother's family is from, to seriously look at what it would look like to regulate the production and sale of cocaine. That's a huge, like, globe-changing attempt, and it's going to be very difficult to do. And it's partially in reaction to the US's kind of defining of Colombian drug policy over the course of the last 3-4 decades. So I'm encouraged to see the possibility of really thoughtful regulated systems existing, but I don't feel like there's a single place that is doing that super, super well. And the closest thing you might see for psychedelics is countries in South America that have some light regulatory or loose access to sacred plants. But that, again, is a little bit different because in almost all those cases, we're talking about plants that are originated in that place, that have a geographic tie, a cultural, indigenous, traditional tie, which just by nature, I think, needs to be regulated differently from like drugs, drugs in general, or controlled substances in general, for the same reasons that we kind of brought up when we were talking about the religious use question. Like these are different systems. I think with a religious or spiritual use system, you want the government as far outside of it as possible. You know, you don't want the government deciding who has a religion and what it is and so on. But with a medical or regulated adult use system, you actually want lots of regulation in most cases, you know, with a medical system in particular. So, you know, even if the use is not so different, the frameworks are so incredibly different that I haven't seen a single place where there's like the whole range there. You see slivers of it, but not the whole piece.
I want to give, since we're running low on time, I want to give each of you an opportunity to just kind of give a sort of a summary or a tweet, kind of a tweet length response to, you know, what you'd like to see immediately in what's your number one priority for federal reform, or alternatively, how can people out there in the audience, what can they do today to make a difference if they want to get involved with one of your organizations, or, you know, should they be writing to their representatives? What can they do to get involved in this policy landscape?
Thanks for that question, Mason. And we haven't really been very loud about this potential future activity for HEAL yet, but one of the big places where we want to train our focus soon is on building that connective tissue between the really active and energetic work and activism that's going on out in states and local jurisdictions across the country, and start to train that fire on Washington, D.C. So as we are working with the National Council on Federal Psychedelics Priorities, trying to come up with what HEAL's sort of policy framework looks like for our work, we also want to start thinking about, again, creating those linkages. So I give the self-serving answer. Please go to our website, www.healing-equity.org. You can sign up for our newsletter, and if you're interested, we will, over the course of the next probably 6 months or so, start really encouraging people to engage a little bit more with us to try and create this network and mycelial connections between what's going on out in communities across the country and what's happening in Washington, D.C., so that we can exchange information and resources and really try to make this change happen in a mindful and comprehensive way that we can all feel good about and like represents what we all want.
And I will similarly give a plug for the Psychedelic Bar Association. If you're a lawyer who wants to lawyer psychedelically, or you work with psychedelic clients or interested in that, please reach out to us. Just kind of generally, Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicine has really beautiful content and resources, community forums every week or every other week, wonderful publications. So, I guess what I would say is deep in kind of along the lines of what we've been talking about, which is, deep listening, deep engagement, the sort of important moment that we are at, and connecting with others in the space and listening to all of these different kind of points of view and really educating ourselves, and then educating our elected officials and really, people in our community, so that we can learn from some of the challenges both in cannabis as well as kind of the broader dominant paradigm and industries and kind of old ways that we really need to lay aside, because we as human beings certainly, there's a lot of trauma and a lot of healing that we have the opportunity to receive, not just from psychedelics or plant medicines, but from each other, from being in community with each other, from listening and hearing from different cultural perspectives. So that's what I will offer, and thank you.
I'd really like to see a harmonization between different policy paradigms. I don't think it's true that decriminalization, legal or regulated use, medical use, spiritual use are zero sum. And I think the idea that only one or two of those can work at the expense of the others is a myth. And it's not exactly something that's been done before. And the idea of trying to figure out multiple regulatory approaches for similar styles or approaches to use of a particular substance is a novel question. It's one of the things that we haven't solved in cannabis. How do you not continue criminalization of people who can't afford licenses, for example? Like, how do we really split that up? But what I'd really like to see is a harmonization between these different approaches. And I think that's why it's worth going slowly and one step at a time to see how do these things work with each other instead of trying to create a zero sum. I think that all of the above, like I said, medicalization, regulated adult use, full decriminalization, as well as spiritual use, like can and should all be able to work together. And I think that that's something that's, to me, is one of the biggest challenges that not just the psychedelic field, but the drug policy field in general has to solve for, but also can offer to broader policy reform in general. So I think that that would be it. And besides that, I agree with the things that Micah and Ariel said. I think understanding the nuance that these substances offer. And I think lastly, not getting tied into a single framework with them. One of the things about psychedelics is that they can be healing potentially for some people, but they're not that, and have never only been that. And I think they're also tools of catalyst and transformation and confrontation, and have historically been used in a lot of different ways. I think not to let our thinking around them get reduced simply because those are the systems that we think that we have to apply them to. Kind of with respect to our question on the DEA and FDA, like we don't have to only think within the current bounds, and also we must think about how to build things toward that visionary future world we're hoping for, one step at a time.
That's a great. Sorry, no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say a stupid joke about how did we do on tweet length final.
Oh, terribly, but I was very pleased that you didn't follow my rules. So thank you for that. Now, this has been a wonderful conversation, a lot of fun. We need far more time, so I hope we'll continue the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to our audience. Thanks to the Petrie-Flom Center Have a great day and hope to see you all again soon. Take care.